Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Rational Space Disputations. For people who are just tuning in for the first time to the program, it's a 2-hour program. And for the first hour, I ask a guest that I invite on questions. And then for the second hour, we turn the controls over to the guest and the guest asks me questions. This is just to keep things fair and also to cover anything that might not have been covered in the first hour. So my guest today is Mark Hecht. Welcome to the program, Mark.
Thank you, Francis. It's a pleasure to be here.
And Mark and I know each other very well. Mark and I actually were colleagues at Mount Royal University. Mark was a contract faculty member from 2008 until 2019, and I actually started in 2008 at Mount Royal as well. And he has a master's degree from the University of Manitoba in city planning and taught in the area of geography at Mount Royal. And he's currently a political candidate and also is involved in a lot of writing activities at the same time. So I'm very interested in talking to Mark today because Mark and I, actually Mark was pushed out of Mount Royal University in 2019, a couple of years before I was pushed out. So actually Mark gave me some insights. Mark's case gave me some insights into my own situation at Mount Royal. So we want, especially in the first hour, to talk quite a lot about what happened to Mark. But before we get into all those details, I thought, Mark, you could just give the audience a sense of, you know, what your interests are, what you're currently involved in, what you're all about.
What am I currently involved in? Well, I guess leaving Mount Royal was a real turning point in my life where I thought, you know, there's some major shifts in society that are going on, and I can either sit on the sidelines or I can be involved in pushing back against the things that I wasn't particularly pleased with. And so one of the things I recently did was become a candidate for the People's Party of Canada, whether you like them or not. They're certainly the only party in Canada that's been standing up and saying this entire woke ideology is problematic. And the ideological extremism that we're seeing in post-secondary educations, in fact, all educational fields right now and across society, is a problem. And we need to talk about it openly. So yeah, I was a political candidate last year in the last federal election, and sort of that's the role I've been playing. I've been doing some writing on the side as well, as you mentioned. But I think ultimately it all started back in back in Mount Royal.
Yes. Okay, Mark. So let's have it. Let's have your story. Let's hear your story, and then we can get into the details a little bit more after you tell us what happened.
Okay, it is a slightly convoluted story, but let's go right back to the beginning. So, like you, I started at Mount Royal back in 2008. I found it was a great institution. It was very collegial. People were friendly. They were very open. People love to go to pubs and have a beer and talk about the ideologies of the day and banter back and forth in the kind of way that you would expect of faculty at a university. Always challenging ideas and having enjoyment in doing it, even if we didn't always agree. But I think, like you've often mentioned, there was kind of a change in the atmosphere, maybe somewhere around 2014, 15, 16, something like that, both in the faculty and to a certain degree the students. The students have always been fantastic. But even in the student body, there was some changes going on where the idea of challenging tough subjects was no longer open for debate. It was either an ideological you agreed or you were shunned. So by the time we got to 2019, I was honestly starting to get a little bit tired of the university atmosphere. I was getting a little bit tired of Calgary, and I was, ready to move on to something, well, to at least move somewhere else. And I was thinking Vancouver Island. I did my undergraduate degree at UVic, and I loved it, and I have friends here. And I thought, well, maybe it's time to go to Vancouver Island. So I set about putting that plan in place, but at the same time, I still wanted to do something which I was really quite keen about, which was leading a field trip to Europe. I'd always wanted to do these field trips, and I thought that'd be a fantastic thing to do. So I set that in place as well. Over the summer of 2019, I got a grant from the international department at Mount Royal to go and explore an actual route and set up a curriculum, which I did. So I got full funding for that. And I let my employer know that I was no longer going to be taking on contracts as of December, the end of December 2019, but I'd still come back to Calgary, in the spring session and run these field trips. And everyone seemed quite pleased about that idea, and we were moving forward with it. And then I have an interest in the patterns in biological speciation. It's kind of part of a biogeography course I developed. Biogeography was actually a very popular course in our department. So I'd set that up, and it's a course that looks at patterns across landscapes of how plants and animals distribute themselves, why they exist, where they do, and how they got there. And you see a lot of patterns in the biological realm that can be correlated to a certain degree with human patterns as well. A lot of this tying to a certain degree into diversity, biodiversity, diversity. I mean, there's linkages between high areas of biological diversity, and that's connected to cultural diversity as well, things like that. So anyway, I was starting to see all this talk about how diversity is a strength. And I was getting pretty pissed off with how simplistic the conversation was around this idea, and that it was a very rigid messaging that was going on, particularly by our government. Diversity is our strength. Well, diversity is not necessarily a strength at all, but nobody wanted to say that. So I did. And I wrote it in an op-ed, and I pitched it to the National Post. I pitched it to the Vancouver Sun. I heard nothing from the National Post, but the editor, Gordon Clark at the Vancouver Sun, who's been around for a long time, has very good experience at taking ideas, and if they're well articulated and supported by evidence, he'll publish them. So he did. He published mine on Friday, September 6th of 2019.
Yeah.
It didn't take long for the Twitter crowd to lose their mind when I had essentially said that ethnic diversity erodes social trust, which it does. It's well known in social science circles. There's nothing unusual about that statement. But a lot of people didn't like that idea for various reasons, which we can get into later. But anyway, so it exploded on Twitter. And by the Saturday, I think around noon, the piece had been taken down by the Vancouver Sun, which is really unusual for a paper to actually rescind or retract something they've already published. So at that point, I knew my life had slightly taken a different path than I was expecting. But it didn't take long for the administration at Mount Royal to have slightly mixed messaging. In one sense, they were saying I had the freedom to say what I wanted. And yet at the same time, they quietly were trying to distance me. And then they also canceled the field school. And to add to that, I had already set up this conversation with people I knew at UVic in the geography department, because I was thinking, I'm going to go to Victoria, I'll move to Victoria and I'll start teaching in the geography department at UVic. That'd be fantastic. I know some people. We already had this conversation and they said, oh, it'd be great to have you on board. And then as soon as the op-ed came out, there was radio silence at UVic, which is becoming, it's as soon as you are a pariah in society, you're not going to be hired anywhere else.
Yep.
And so people, you know all about this. This is pretty common to see academics who were canceled and then never hired again anywhere else. So I had sort of a lesser degree of that happen to me. I didn't have a formal contract, but it looked like I was going to pick up something at UVic and then it went silent. But interestingly, in the whole process of this happening, that's where you and I met, actually.
Yep, that's where we met. Yep. So
Yeah.
we didn't know each other before that time.
No.
That what happened is that we had a Mount Royal Faculty Association Facebook page, which was quite volatile at the best of times. And this was the beginning of the end for the Facebook page, because a bunch of faculty members, including, I want to emphasize, one member of the executive board of the Faculty Association, were on there defaming Mark. And that led me to contact Mark and tell him that there was a bunch of people talking about him on the Facebook page and he should at least be, joined so he could be aware of what was being said about him. So, so that was good. And I was able to, there was a whole bunch of people. I can't remember the number, but we did organize. Like, that was kind of the disheartening aspect about it, is that, Mount Royal throughout this time has been a better institution than most, in terms of there are about 15 to 20 faculty members who are prepared to stand up and, support people who are under fire like that. But it made no difference in the end. So other things that should be, anything else that happened, Mark, with respect to that case that you remember? I have some questions about it, but I just wanted to make sure that you've told the whole story. As I remember, it didn't end with the geography department at UVic. There was other things that you suffered because of your op-ed.
Oh, yeah. Once I moved to Victoria, I thought, well, I'll make a new life in Victoria and stay away from academia from now on. So I applied to the Naval Reserves here in Victoria. And, I'm a bit of an old guy now. I'm 52, but you can still apply to the Navy Reserves up until 57. And I passed all the physical exams and all the intellectual competency exams and so on. I got all the way through right to the end. And then at the last moment, I got a letter saying, a number of things, but they were basically saying, we don't like what you said in the Vancouver Sun, and so we're not going to hire you. We're not going to allow you into the military.
Yeah.
Again, I mean,
it's amazing. It's amazing how this spreads throughout society. So I wanted to just ask you about the cancellation of your field school, because this is a matter of contention at Mount Royal as to what happened with respect to that. So how did that happen, the cancellation of the field school? Did they just sort of tell you your field school is canceled? How did that unfold?
So before the op-ed, we had already arranged to have 3 information sessions for students to come and see if they wanted to go to this thing. And so that was in, I think the first one was set for like September 15th or something, not very long, like a few days after this whole thing exploded. So that was the first information session. Once this whole thing exploded, the dean, Jonathan Withy, basically called me into his office and said, for various reasons, we've decided not to offer the field school. Well, this happened actually, sorry, I got called into his office 2 hours before the first information session was to go forward. So
Mhm.
I was in his office and he was explaining this. Time was ticking by. And I said, well, this has to do with the op-ed, doesn't it? And of course, he shook his head and denied it and said, no, 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 it doesn't
Mhm.
have.
Yeah.
Of course it did.
Mhm.
So anyway, in that time period, the information session was actually about to go forward and students were showing up. And so I asked international or someone in the international department to actually run down and just, go in and tell the students, sorry, this is canceled now. So students were interested, they were showing up.
Yeah.
This was very last minute decision by the administration to say, no, 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 we're going to cancel this thing.
Yeah.
And then, so we were trying to figure out, well, was this actually due to the op-ed or was it something else? But there were people in the department. There's one, the geography coordinator. Am I allowed to? Yeah, I'm going to say names. Troy Burnett. Bit of a wishy-washy guy. I thought he was a friend, but he's not really. He's a bit of an asshole. Anyway, he and the department head, Brian Sevick, had obviously conspired to say, we don't like Mark's views. We should make sure this field trip gets canceled and it's not part of our department offering. Troy Burnett mentioned that to another fellow in the department. And this other fellow was willing to talk about it if anyone was to ask him. But you can probably elaborate on that a little bit more.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, it was pretty clear that behind the scenes, people were trying to make sure that my field school was canceled.
Yes.
Because they didn't agree with my views.
So how do you know that, and you shouldn't don't mention the name of the other faculty member because they are still Mount Royal.
Yeah.
But how do you know that your field school was canceled because of your views and not just because of some other administrative kind of matter that came into play?
Because this unnamed individual was told directly from Troy Burnett, who's the geography coordinator,
Oh yeah.
that Troy had said, paraphrasing, yeah, we canceled Mark's field school because of his views in the op-ed.
Yeah. Yes, and this is a very difficult problem. And so you belonged to a union at the time.
Yep.
And so wasn't the union concerned about the fact that your academic freedom, what appears to be like, and this would have to be, obviously investigated and things like that to make this determination, but it certainly seems to be an allegation that your academic freedom was violated.
Yeah, and unions at universities are supposed to uphold the principle of defending the faculty.
Yeah.
Of course, in Canada, we have this complex scenario where unions are often more tightly aligned with the administration, especially if they have individuals on it that have certain views.
Yeah.
So I think in my particular case, some of the members that were in the union or the union leadership took offense to my op-ed, and those personal feelings clouded their judgment over the roles that they were supposed to play.
Yeah. And as well, and this is something that I'm currently interested in your case, because your case was a kind of a precursor to my own case. So I'm very interested in the kind of what led up to it and everything. A number of faculty members were actually opposing or denouncing you. There's a number of faculty members who were denouncing you. How did you find out about that?
It was actually you that directed me to the Facebook page.
Mm-hmm.
And that was sort of the first time I saw things actually written down denouncing me.
Yeah.
But You know what? It's almost like you were like the greatest defender of me and my case, which I really appreciate.
Yeah.
Because
There's a number of other people as well, I should mention,
yeah,
who were, so we, a group of people, I can't remember the number, but it's about 10 faculty members who signed a letter supporting you. But the other disturbing thing that happened, and I'm not sure if you remember this, and I actually have the document that I'm going to be, that I have posted myself on my own Facebook page, but that's going to be part of my own work as well. There were 30 faculty members who signed a letter that went to administration. And the letter was not CC'd to you, and you were able to get that letter through Freedom of Information, that letter.
Yeah.
And I'm going to post that letter so that people can see it. The difficulty with that letter is that what happens when you get a letter through Freedom of Information is that Mount Royal's Freedom of Information office redacts large portions of the letter.
Yeah.
So we really don't see very much of the letter. We see a few sentences in the letter, but it was a couple-page letter. And then all the signatures of the people who signed that letter are redacted in the letter. So we never actually did find out who the people were that were denouncing you, which I find to be very disturbing. Like, if people are going to go to administration and denounce another professor, then at least that professor should be able to know who these people are who are doing this. But what happens is that they're protected by the administration, which I don't think is right. And it's certainly something that I'm pursuing, not with your letter, but there's an earlier letter that had a number of faculty members sign it as well, that I'm trying to go to the privacy commissioner to try to get the letter released, and also the names of the people who signed that letter for that to be released. But the problem with that is that it takes several years when you go to the privacy commissioner to be able to have get that released, and you have to go to a hearing and all these sorts of things like that. So that was another very disturbing part of your case.
Mm-hmm.
The final thing that happened, which was the infamous General Faculties Council meeting.
Yeah.
What happened there?
You know what? I wasn't there. You probably have a better sense of what
I wasn't
happened.
there. Unfortunately, if there ever was a General Faculties Council meeting that I wish I had been at, it's that one.
Yeah.
But I wasn't there either, although I did know two colleagues who were at that faculty association meeting. Do you have a sense of what happened at that General Faculties Council meeting?
Only from descriptions I've heard from you, and so in fact you're probably better at describing what happened there than I am.
Yes. Well, and I wasn't there, so I have to be a bit careful about this. There evidently was a recording of that meeting, which was done by the student paper at Mount Royal. I think it's called the Calgary Journal is the name of the student journalism paper, not the Reflector, but there's a journalism program, and they have a paper that they do. Anyway, evidently the person who's in charge of that program recorded it, or people were told it was being recorded. I tried by going to the Calgary Journal to get the recording, but I was unable to get the recording, which I would still really like to obtain if possible. But I I was alerted to something disturbing that was going to happen at that meeting. And I don't know why I didn't go to that. I'm still kicking myself for not getting it myself together. But there was a group that formed. It was called the Indigenous and People of Color Support Network. That was a group that was formed in 2019. That group became the Mount Royal University Anti-Racism Coalition, MRU Anti-Racism. So MRU Anti-Racism hadn't yet formed, but you had this Indigenous and People of Color Support Network. Anyway, they organized a whole bunch of people to go to that General Faculties Council meeting and hold up signs which said, we belong here, racism does not. That was the nature of the sign. So everyone was holding these signs up, and it was amusing because, according to the people that were there, your name was not mentioned.
Mm.
So, but the op-ed, someone at some point in the discussions, made some reference to that op-ed. So, but it was obvious from the context that you were the person who was being referred to in these signs. So basically, and this is the kind of ironic thing about this notion of inclusion, is that inclusivity means that you have to exclude certain people who make certain members of oppressed groups feel that they don't belong. And because your op-ed made people feel that they didn't belong, then obviously you don't belong at Mount Royal, is kind of the message that's been going on. Anyway, this GFC meeting, and this is why I would really have liked to have got a recording of it, was a real circus. Like, was a complete circus with all sorts of people grandstanding about various things, all sorts of people in the audience holding up these posters and so on. One of the most disturbing things that happened is the president of the Faculty Association. They have what's called they're called pre-GFC meetings. So you go to the meeting before GFC, and this is usually GFC counselors who go, but anyone can show up to discuss what's going to happen at GFC, so that if there's an issue that needs to be kind of voted on, then members are aware of the implications of that for faculty and so on. Anyway, at this meeting, pre-GFC meeting, the president of the Faculty Association provided these you belong here, or we belong here, racism does not. She had these posters there, and then she offered to go provide some tape to people if they wanted to tape these signs on because some people take their laptops to GFC, so they could have them, posted on their laptops during this GFC meeting, right? And so at the time, I was absolutely flabbergasted about this, because this is the president of the association who appears to be taking on the role of encouraging certain members of the Faculty Association to kind of attack another member of the Faculty Association, which I think is a pretty much of an unheard of kind of situation that happened at Mount Royal. And it gives people a little bit of the kind of tone that was unfolding at Mount Royal at that time.
Yeah, it's a bit disturbing for the head of the union to be taking sides in any particular debate, isn't it?
Yes, they're supposed to remain impartial with respect to these matters. And what happened with respect to the unions? Like, did as far as I remember, you filed a grievance about your field school being canceled.
Yep.
What happened to that grievance?
Oh, there's a couple stages in the grievance process. I think I went through stage 1. So the union took it forward to the administration, and then I don't know if it got to stage 2 or stage 3, but essentially the union concluded that it was essentially an unwinnable case against the administration, and so they were going to drop the case going forward.
Yes. And so why did they think it was unwinnable?
I don't know. I honestly haven't put a lot of thought into this anymore, or even then.
Yeah.
No. I think half my mind was just, I'm done with the politics of academia and the people not playing the roles that they're supposed to play, especially union leaders.
Yeah. Do you think that you're being a contract faculty member played a role in sort of the difficulties and taking your case forward?
As long as I was at Mount Royal for those 11 years,
Mhm.
in my own department, contract faculty, I would say, was treated like everyone else. We were treated quite fairly, and we weren't treated like second-class citizens
Mm.
within the department. But I think in terms of this actual case, I believe, and I think it'd be fair to say that, yeah, contract faculty it's easier to get rid of contract faculty by the administration when they don't particularly like them. But, even your case now stands out as this leading case of
Yeah,
showing that tenure is no longer a
yeah.
sacrosanct position.
But we'll see. The good thing about, and that's why I think it was so difficult, like, because we really did try to defend you in this case, but because a contract faculty member's employment is so unstable and
Mhm.
so there's so few protections, and that's why it should be well, it's alarming in the sense that tenure seems to be under threat in the way that it is. But what's happening more and more in universities is that the larger and larger percentage of the faculty are contract faculty members. And, in just looking at your case, there's sort of plausible deniability about it.
Yeah.
Like, it seems to me, just looking at the facts, well, first of all, the union said that it investigated your case, and then it found, and it said that it was hearsay, all the kind of allegations about the academic freedom being violated were hearsay. That was not true,
Right.
because
They
we had a
didn't.
faculty member, and I'm not going to name who that it is because they're still at Mount Royal, who had these discussions with people in the department who heard it himself. So if he hears it himself, it's not hearsay.
Right.
But anyway, but I asked this faculty member if he had been approached by the union, if they'd asked him if anyone had, because his name was provided to the union to go in as evidence for your case, that it was an academic freedom issue, and no one from the union had approached him. So the quote unquote investigation that was done did not, was not very in depth, and certainly didn't go to the person who would have been the person who was able to kind of provide direct evidence that it was an academic freedom issue, that your field school appears. And again, we have to be careful, because since there was no thorough investigation of what happened, we don't know for sure. Like, and that's the good thing about my case, is that it is going to go to arbitration. So
Mhm.
all of these matters, which, some people are going, well, I don't know if that's true, and so on. This is all going to be under cross-examination and have all sorts of evidence, which is going to be provided, which in your case, it would have been really good if your case had gone to arbitration, because then we would have been able to have the evidence being presented, which never did occur. And it was very difficult to do so because of your contract faculty status, and the fact that you have very few protections. And, the university is just saying, well, there wasn't enough interest, or these kinds of comments, which, unless we had the evidence actually provided in some kind of impartial setting, we would never be able to make that determination or not. And the fact they didn't go to arbitration, I think it was a serious violation of due process. But as Mark said, Mark had it, and Mark didn't want to spend the next 5 years fighting out all these various battles, which have to be fought. Like, that's kind of the key thing.
Yeah, they do have to be fought in all the different arenas of society.
Yes. Okay, so I think that gives you, so all is not well for people who are listening to this. These are major issues that are ongoing, and the fact that Mark can write one op-ed in the Vancouver Sun and effectively have your academic career destroyed. That's basically what happened.
And we have to consider how many other contract faculty looked at my case and went, well, I better keep my mouth shut about just about everything. I mean, atmosphere of fear is definitely pervading academia right now.
Yeah.
And as you say, as contract faculty increases in the number of teaching staff that are in universities, it means that the level of inquiry into ideas is obviously going to be squashed.
Yes.
So pretty serious.
So we talked about the whole kind of Mount Royal kind of controversy. What was it? So first of all, I guess we should get the argument. So what was just so horrendous about this argument that you were making that warranted your career being ended, your academic career being ended? So what were you arguing? What were the arguments that you were putting forward in this piece?
Oh, I was being a little bit cheeky, but I was essentially saying that when you have an increase in ethnic diversity in a society, it disrupts the level of trust across the entire society.
Mm.
And so I used the example of Muslims in Denmark. So two topics all in one that are sort of taboo. But the point I'm making, though, is that ethnic diversity erodes social trust. And Robert Putnam was probably the first one to really point this out, much to his own dismay, actually. That the more you increase diversity, particularly ethnic diversity, the more that the level of trust that citizens have between one another, it goes down. So he found this in, he actually had a couple examples, but one was, for example, in the United States. I think he was looking at sort of the Midwestern states. He was talking about the difference between like towns that were predominantly Norwegian versus towns that were Swedish or had a historical Swedish background. And if you mix those two together, the level of trust between the sort of Norwegian based groups and the Swedish based groups, trust levels went down in both. So social scientists have been looking at this idea of social trust and saying, well, what is it that increases social trust and what decreases social trust? And if you mix different ethnic groups together, does the trust go down in just one group and not the other? Or does it go down in both? Or, there's different ideas. So there's this conflict theory, which says if you have two groups, they come together and they get to know one another, they actually can get along quite well. One is conflict. If they come together, they have problems and they fight with one another. The other idea is they come together, they get to know one another, and everything's good. And then there's a third theory, which is kind of a mix of things. So social scientists have been debating these ideas since essentially Robert Putnam came out with this theory that ethnic diversity erodes social trust. And for a certain period of time, right after Putnam, most social scientists agreed, oh yeah, probably ethnic diversity does decrease social trust. Then there was evidence to suggest that no, that's not necessarily true. And then there was a meta-analysis that came out in 2021 by 3 researchers out of the University of Copenhagen, who looked at all of the studies that were related to social trust to find out if there was a commonality. Most studies were coming up and saying there's a negative correlation between ethnic diversity and social trust, but the correlation is very small in each study. But with all of the studies together, it became pretty clear that overall, yeah, ethnic diversity does erode social trust. Now, that's not to say that ethnic diversity is a bad thing. I mean, one can look at Switzerland and say, well, they've got 4 basic ethnicities, Swiss, German, French, Italian, and Romansh. And those 4 different groups are part of what Switzerland would call its 4 ethnicities. And they've managed to get along perfectly well for hundreds of years. So it's not to say that ethnic diversity and the conflicts between ethnic diversity can't be overcome. But my point in the article is essentially saying, in Canada's case, if you if you keep bringing in lots of immigrants and they're all coming from different cultural groups or different ethnicities,
Mhm.
We're going to see negative impacts from that.
Mm.
And so we might want to consider having a immigration policy where we bring people in. I didn't say this in the article, but I was essentially alluding to the idea that our immigration policy should probably consider having immigrants that are coming from ethnic groups that are more closely aligned with the values of Canadian society as it exists today.
Mm.
And so there's the World Values Survey, for example, which is an international survey that's been done since 1981 that
Yeah.
looks at these values across sort of an XY continuum or axis. And one is about traditionalism versus individualism. So in Canada, we're quite individualistic as opposed to group oriented. And then the other sort of the y-axis is about oh no, I've forgotten. Religious.
Secularism.
Secularism. Thank you. Secularism at the top and religious leanings towards the bottom.
Yeah.
So countries like Canada, Denmark, all the Scandinavian countries tend to be in that top right box where we're quite
Yep.
individualistic and secular oriented.
Mm-hmm.
So if we bring in immigrants from similar countries, we won't have as much tension, social tension, as if we brought in a lot of people from, say, the bottom left of that box.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people looked at my article and were saying, oh, he's a white nationalist.
Yes, I believe that was
pretty common. So there's
Yeah.
this confusion between race and ethnicity.
Mm.
And, you know, fair enough. The word race has different connotations over time, and people aren't always clear on race versus ethnicity. And even in our government documents, we tend to mix them up quite a bit too.
Yeah.
But if we think about ethnicity as the way a group of people define themselves, and it's typically according to religion, which is a proxy for worldview,
Yeah.
language,
Yeah.
and customs.
Yeah.
Race is like way down as a possible sub point under customs, which most ethnicities don't use. There are some that emphasize it, but most don't.
Yeah.
So when we talk about ethnicities, we're talking about things like British or Haida or Japanese or Huron or
Mm.
and a lot of people took exception to me saying that Canada should probably be a little bit more homogenous, and they thought
Yeah.
I was saying it should be more white, which is not what I was saying.
And you didn't mention that. And I actually had a colleague say to me that you had mentioned the word white in your piece, and I knew you had not, because that was the first thing that I look for when I look at these pieces is,
Yeah.
you know, to what extent are we talking about a cultural situation, or to what extent are we talking about someone making an argument about race?
Yeah.
And I could tell that you were making the argument about culture in
Yeah.
that piece. But I think I was kind of, James Pugh and I in the session a few months, I guess a month ago, we got into this discussion a little bit more. And I think that ethnicity, the term ethnicity has some of these ambiguities. And so that makes it difficult when we really should be talking about culture. So
Yeah.
learned behavior. So, you know, if everyone comes together and they all speak the same language and they all have the same customs and they all have the same kinds of views on, you know, whether religion should be in the public sphere or not, and so on, then they're going to be able to get along much better than one group who thinks that, you know, the government should take a position on various religious questions, and the other group thinks that, you know, government should stay out of religion. Like that those are going to be kind of conflicting positions, incommensurable types of positions. And it just seems to me to be self-evident.
Mhm.
If you bring people together who have very different understandings of what it is that the government should be doing, then obviously it's going to be hard to build commonality amongst those people within a political system.
Right. And that's where you get the breakdown in social trust.
Yes,
As that conflict rises, people start to distrust their fellow citizens,
yes,
and that those bonds of cohesion start to break down.
yes. So I think I really understand the axis about secularism, and you can see that, and that's probably why Islam is such a difficult religion for people who are not Islamic to develop social trust between those groups, because secularism is not a very prized value in Islamic societies.
No, it's typically
Like they sort of expect the state to take on some kind of Islamic type of position. And you saw this with the, the Charlie Hebdo kind of the discussions about the Charlie Hebdo assassinations. And there was actually, I had this as one of my classes that were talking about that there was an Islamic leader in Canada who was saying that obviously it should be illegal for those cartoons to be broadcast, because like this is very insulting to Muslim people that you would have that, and so on. And it was understood that was the value that they had, when if you have people who are secular and their viewpoints, like, well, just don't look at the cartoon then if it's upsetting to you. But that's not that's not how the mindset is kind of approaching this. So I sort of understand that. And there's probably, in surveys, when you ask different religions, do you think that the government should, have blasphemy laws against blasphemy? Some religions are going to score higher on that, the answering yes to that question, than others. Whereas and I assume some aspects of Christianity, or probably Buddhism, or maybe Judaism as well. I don't know, but I would imagine those religions would argue against blasphemy laws in the society.
Yeah.
Whereas other religions would not.
Actually, Ruud Koopman, sort of social science researcher in Europe, he's done a lot of work on the differences between religions, particularly as it relates to Islam. And there's kind of this, there's almost a naive belief among some people that we can all just sort of get along, and fundamentally we all sort of believe the same things and we all want the same things in life.
Yeah.
But it's not true. It's not true at all. He's done a number of surveys and found that, say, among those who are part of the Islamic faith, they're much more willing to use violence for certain ends, whereas Judaism and those in Christian religions, even secular Christian-based societies, are much less willing to use violence for certain things. So, I mean, culture plays a very strong role in how we see the world and what we think should happen or shouldn't happen, and where we set the boundaries of, violence or non-violence and things like that. And
yeah,
we're not all the same.
Yeah. So that, I think that's pretty understandable, and I can really see that in a number of the different debates that are going on. The other axis, though, I find very interesting, and I'm just trying to think what the nature of this group, individualism versus quote unquote group, what's being got at there, and what the kind of, because we all belong to various groups.
Right. Well, this is more like an identity. It's almost connected to, individual identity versus group identity, right?
Yeah.
I mean, do you think of yourself more as an individual in a society, or do you think of yourself as a, let's say, a Mennonite in Canadian society?
Yeah.
Pick any group you want. Are you more
So
attached to
we have
group
Canadian,
identity
right?
or individual?
So we have, for example, in the case of Canada, so there's the group, which is Canadians. So
Yeah.
that's not really seen as being the group, because we're all individuals within this one container known as Canada.
Right.
But what we're talking about is the groups within a state. So if you identify, and even more of a kind of a problematic situation, I would imagine, is people who see their group identity as being more significant than the Canadian identity.
Yeah.
Because then you're dealing with, you've got Canadian laws, which are supposed to apply to all members of Canadian society. If you have a group that sees its own kind of identity and its interactions as being more significant, then what are they going to do if there's a law in Canada that goes against something that is really prized highly by that group?
Right.
Like, that's going to create a conflict, because they're going to find it difficult to abide by whatever it is that law is, which I think is perhaps what's going on there, is that, the people who can't really accept the legitimacy of the Canadian state and see their own the group within Canada as the most, and this potentially could have, in the Indigenous question, kind of, you can sort of see that as having a role to play. We've seen that in various religious communities, the Doukhobors, I guess, being an example, when there was an attempt to, educate Doukhobor children of the Doukhobors, and they were, opposing it and so on. But that's I think that's what's being got at there. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think mostly, yeah.
So the groups within a state that see their own ties with one another as being more significant than a value like abiding by the laws that have been set for everyone.
Yeah. And I think to a certain degree, you're talking about the individual, the individualist mindset is, sort of the center of the world, whereas the group identity is the individual subsumes their identity to be able to fit within that group.
Yeah. Yes.
So they're not going to speak out unless the group leader speaks out.
Yeah. And trust, this is relating to, so the more we have non-secular and group-oriented behavior, and most significantly, I would say, would be sort of tribal forms of behavior. Is tribalism, is there a distinction that is made between tribal types of forms of identification and just kind of other group forms of identification?
In the World Value Survey, you don't see them talking about or using that word tribal. It's just more the general idea of individual versus group.
Yeah. Because I think that might shed some light on it as well. Because if you have tribes within a nation state, that causes a certain amount of conflict, because the tribes, their allegiances to their blood and marriage relationships, as opposed to the idea of the nation, which is that you are, if it's a civic nation, that is. So in political science, we distinguish between civic nations and ethnic nations.
Yeah.
Civic nations are when you see yourself as part of a nation according to like the boundaries of the state and the government and the like the symbols of the nation state, right? So those kinds of nation states, they can absorb immigrants much more easily into those kinds of nation states, because what you do is you get the immigrants to identify with the state boundaries and the symbols of the country. Whereas the ethnic nations are the ones where you have the kind of the sense of nation, the sense of common identity and political aspirations for self-determination come from quote unquote ethnic characteristics, which can be things like language and religion. But then this is where the kind of the definition of ethnicity becomes again a bit of a problem, because it can be kind of inherited ancestral characteristics, which tends to be those characteristics which are tied to racial kinds of characteristics.
Can be, yeah.
And that means that if you're going to have an identity on that basis, you're much more closed to newcomers coming into your society, because you're looking at your common ancestor, and they're not sharing that common ancestor. Like, even if they learned the language and, converted to the religion and all these things, they still wouldn't really be considered to be part of the nation, because they wouldn't have the ancestral kinds of characteristics which were required.
Yeah, I'm going to go slightly off topic, but you could almost argue in Canada, you see a little bit of that, particularly in Quebec, and maybe less so outside Quebec.
Well, Quebec's a really interesting case, because historically they used to have a lot more of the kind of ancestral features that they used to stress. So you might have heard of this concept that is called pure laine.
Yeah.
And I believe that's called pure wool, or
pure laine.
So the idea is that you're of the stock, and you hear this sometimes when people say old stock Canadians. So it's about your ancestors, and that you are, your ancestors came here, 300, 400 years ago, and you've been here since then. So it's got some ancestral characteristics. So Quebec started off with, there's some kind of elements of that in the kind of the idea of nationalism. And then gradually what happened is that became replaced by language. Language became the very, very important characteristic of the Quebecois. And if you learned French and you became very immersed within the French language, and you could communicate very well in that language, you would be you'd pretty much be accepted within the Quebec culture. Whereas, a number of decades before that, it would have been much more difficult, because you would have sort of been looked on with suspicion because of your ancestry. Your ancestry would not have been seen as so Quebec's a very interesting case to look at in terms of nationalism, because they've kind of had a transformation to some extent in how they view being part of that nation, and it's largely done now on the basis of language, and obviously religion no longer. Quebec is one of the most secular, I think it is the most secular province in Canada. So it used to have a very strong Roman Catholic kind of character to the identity, and now that's gone by the wayside. And really, it does make sense, actually, that language should be sort of the dominant identifier, because that's kind of what shapes our thoughts. And it's very difficult to kind of feel you're part of the society if you don't have a good understanding of the kinds of, kind of language references. And I've heard people say that when they learn another language, and they're funny in their own language. And then they go and learn another language, and no one thinks that they're funny, because they just don't have a grasp of the kind of sort of language types of rules and so on. And you can kind of see how that works.
I had a student admit, and she said, in English, I'm very quiet, and in Hindi, I'm very spicy.
Yeah.
It's true. Language changes how we interact with the world.
Yes. So I was interested in your mentioning Switzerland as a case. So Switzerland, with the 4 kinds of cultural groupings, we won't call it ethnicity, because that's such a kind of but it's not because of ancestry. It's because basically they speak different languages. And they probably have some customs that are different amongst all of them. Is there religious differences?
I think in the past, kind of like Quebec, religious differences were emphasized quite strongly, but not so much today.
Yes. And so it's largely a battle over like official languages and things like that?
Well, Switzerland has come to a long time ago, it came to the consensus that, there's 4 groups, we'll all get along. And as long as we have, the Swiss have essentially figured out that as long as everyone has some representation in government, and feels like their voice is being listened to, then the system tends to work.
Yes.
I mean, it doesn't always work perfectly, but they've got it pretty close in terms of making sure that's sort of adhered to. But they also have a direct democracy too, which is a little different than most other places.
Yeah. And they seem to be not that different. Like in terms of
Yeah.
this scale that you're talking about, the secularism and the individual versus group,
Yeah, there's not a lot of difference between
like they're quite individualistic in other words that they,
yeah.
Although I don't know to what extent do they see themselves as being Swiss versus that particular group, right?
And I think that differs too. I mean, I don't know the Swiss case very well. I did actually have an interview with a Swiss researcher, and we talked about this. And that was actually written up in Merriam West magazine.
Oh yeah.
But he said, most people identify themselves as Swiss before they identify themselves as one of those cultural groups today.
Mhm.
Although if there was one group that identifies themselves as this cultural group before the national group, is probably the Swiss Germans.
Okay.
They would say, oh yeah, I'm Swiss German, or I'm German that lives in Switzerland.
Okay.
Whereas the others tend to say, oh, I'm Swiss.
Hmm.
That's my understanding of it. I could be a little off on that, but
Yeah.
So
'Cause I think that's part of your argument is it's easier for the Swiss groups to get along because they don't have that many differences in terms of these kinds of axes that you're talking about. Like there's no members of those groups that want to have a theocratic character of Switzerland.
right. The general
Whereas,
consensus across Switzerland is the democratic process as it exists now is just, of course you would have that. Why would you?
yeah.
Everyone sort of agrees that makes sense not to have a theocracy. Yeah.
Anyway, Mark, well, we've come to the hour point.
Oh, that was
in the
quick.
discussion. I know it's amazing. People always think, well, it's going to be forever, like an hour, but it just goes by really quickly. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn it over to you, and you can ask me questions.
Okay. It's quite interesting that we're actually doing this conversation right now, isn't it? Because
Yeah.
I think, as already hinted at, my case at Mount Royal flared up before yours did.
Yep.
Although there were some precursor cases that you were involved with.
Yep.
But in many ways, you were like the defender of me more than anybody else ever was. And in fact, in many ways, you know my case better than I do.
Yeah, I do. And I'm actually writing on your case as well. So your case is going to form a chapter of my book, when the Academy Goes Woke, or something like that. So it's a case study of the Mount Royal situation. And I should mention that your case is number 2. So there was actually a case before your case, which we cannot mention the person who was involved in this, because they're still very worried about their mental health and everything, and are worried about things going wrong for them.
Right.
But there was a person who was taken down a couple of years before you, or actually a number of years before, maybe 5 years before you, who wasn't pushed out, but basically had their life destroyed by this. And that was started in 2014 at Mount Royal. And I'd love to talk about that case, but I can't, because I was in my interactions with this person, they just are so traumatized by what happened that they basically say they don't want to go through it again to have that discussed. But I saw that person have their life destroyed. And then I saw what happened to you in 2019. And so I could see the writing on the wall by watching those 2 cases unfold. And the first case was particularly bad because those of us who would have been supporters of this person never heard about it until it was too late and it was already over. And this is really one of the biggest problems, is that the university or universities, because of their power, their institutional power, they're able to impose gag orders on you and stop you from and threaten you to say that if you talk about your case, if you do anything, then you will be subject to more discipline and you will possibly face termination if you talk about the case, and that really prevents us from gaining an understanding of the kinds of problems that we're facing, and you pretty much have to put your job on the line in order for things to come out, and basically, well, I didn't have any I didn't have any choice in the matter, because I actually played by the rules. I didn't talk about my case when I was, even though one of the people who had instigated everything, they broke confidential. They left Mount Royal and they broke confidentiality and talked to the Calgary Herald. And I asked Mount Royal to release me from the confidentiality demand so that I could defend myself against this person who was basically painting me as this kind of person who had created this culture of fear at Mount Royal and so on. And Mount Royal refused to allow me to discuss, even though one of the people had left and had broken confidentiality themselves. So, but that's going to be the subject of arbitration matter. So this is finally going to come out in the arbitration discussion that's going to occur. But so anyway, so things have been kind of accelerating at Mount Royal starting in 2014. And your case was one of the kind of
I wanted to ask you about sort of the broad level discussion. I know there's certain people that have predicted, quite a number of years back, that we would reach this point in society where we'd have, overproduction of the elite, so to speak. I've forgotten his name who talks about that. But he's essentially saying he said many years ago, we will have these problems within academia and other areas of society where we've created too many elites. So we have now baristas that are, working at Starbucks and they've got a PhD and they're quite upset about the position that they're sitting on in terms of the social ladder. And that's causing a lot of conflicts. And as far as I understand his theory or his ideas, it's that this has also reached into academia where people at the lower end of the spectrum are using some of the nastiest tactics to move sort of the old professors out of the way so they can take over the social ladder or the next rung on the social ladder. Yeah. And ultimately this is part of what woke culture is all about. And I mentioned this to you, I think, at some point when we were back in Mount Royal together, but you had talked about something else, rentierism or something like
rent
that.
Seeking.
So, yeah, can you explain that a bit?
Yeah, so rent seeking, and this is what's going on a lot in these conflicts. Like, people think it's about ideas, the conflict, when the conflict is about people trying to compete for resources within the university, and that's what often these kinds of advocacy studies, and that's part of my research on the university, which I'm tracing, and actually I'll just do a plug for my book here, my manuscript. This is the Woke Academy. The Woke Academy. So I did this manuscript. I guess I've been working on it for a number of years, and I was going to finish it during my last sabbatical, but I got all these problems started happening, so I had to just devote myself full time to fighting my case, which is still relevant because it's part of the part of everything that's happening. But in this manuscript, I'm talking about like the unfolding of things since the 1960s that have happened with these advocacy studies programs, which are the Black studies and Indigenous studies and queer studies and women's studies and so on. So those all started in the 60s, and they had a very kind of marginal position within the academy. But what happened with when postmodernism began to become accepted within the academy, that took away our standards. So it undermined the standards, the scientific standards, the scholarly standards of the university. And this was allowed, took away any defense to try to stop these people from taking over the university. And now they have taken over the university starting in, like the late 2000s. And then they got the diversity offices and so on. And now they are firmly in charge of what's going on and are actively pushing out anyone that tries to go against them. But what they're doing is they're trying to divert resources in the university to themselves. So most of these battles are, someone who's working in like a department and they're kind of an activist. And historically, they wouldn't have really gotten any kind of funding and so on for what it is that they were doing. But now with postmodernism asserting itself and reified postmodernism, which is wokeism, identity politics has become totalitarian, they use the activism as a cudgel to extract various university resources and have university resources diverted to them. And you see it now with the hiring. Like, this is where it's really noticeable, is the hiring. And because of my circumstances that I've been having to hire to apply on jobs to show that I'm trying to mitigate the damages that have been suffered in my case. And I've had to apply on several positions, and every single one, you've got to outline your, how you support diversity, inclusion, and equity, and so on. So these activists, the ones that are involved in, trying to, have all these irrational viewpoints accepted as knowledge, and, are fighting for various, groups to have more representation and so on within the university. The more you are an activist, the better chances of you being able to be hired is in the university. So it's now become very much, sort of intertwined with all the hiring decisions that are being made, all the kind of grants that are being given out in universities. These are all tied to, this diversity, inclusion, and equity types of, viewpoints that are, deeply, deeply intertwined with the reified postmodernism.
And sometimes it can be quite subtle, but even if we go back to the union at Mount Royal, I noticed in their budget, one of the line items when I was there was no such thing as advocacy. But I think right after my case, I saw one of their budgets and they had suddenly put in this line item called advocacy, and it was a large sum of money. And it seemed completely in conflict. A union is supposed to be impartial in representing its members. And then all of a sudden they've got this line item of advocacy. One question is, what the heck what do you mean by advocacy? And why is this line item such a large, why does it have?
Yeah, that might be, because I know they talk about advocacy as, fighting for post-secondary education.
Which, okay.
So that's fine, because that's within the mandate
of the union.
Of the union. And that was largely the advocacy. They had the advocacy officer and the advocacy committee. And this was supposed to be about, kind of fighting for post-secondary education, those sorts of activities. That was initially, but I'm sure, the diversity, inclusion, and equity kind of stuff is now, that's part of it too. I'm sure that's what's going on. And that's kind of the disturbing thing, because, this is kind of a political position that not everyone shares within the union. Yet it's kind of assumed that, I guess, we should adopt this position, yet you're not allowed to talk about it. Like, like,
Mhm.
if you try to have a discussion about it,
Which you did.
you're going to get, all sorts of angry. Everyone's going to be start to become more and more angry, and then you're going to be seen as, relentlessly asking questions with ill intent. Which is how this is how my activities were characterized when, I'd hear some kind of diversity, inclusion, and equity kind of, arguments, which often are very unclear as to what's being
Mhm.
talked about, right? Because they'll say, we've got all these problems with systemic racism and so on. You'll say, well, what do you mean by systemic racism? And then you'll hear that, we only have, 2% of professors are Black, or whatever it is, or we have no administrators who are Black. And this is a big, huge problem. And this is indication of systemic racism. You say, well, but sometimes you don't have any Black people applying on senior administrative positions, right? So how are you supposed to hire more Black? Like, first of all, should you really have that as a goal? Like, shouldn't you really be more concerned about making sure people aren't discriminated against? But if you start asking these kinds of questions in various forums, you notice everyone getting very angry about it.
Mhm.
And in fact, all of my kind of harassment investigations that I've been subjected to, this was a big thing that was being, like, I never did get found to have engaged in harassment for asking questions, but this was certainly on the minds of the complainants, that they considered it to be harassment. And this is generally the kind of attitude which exists, that if you question diversity, inclusion, and equity, you're sort of a harassing person who's sort of asking things that, when you should really just, if you're a good person,
Just go along with it.
you should accept this. Like, and anyone who doesn't has obviously got something wrong with them. Like, that's kind of almost the way it's being portrayed in these various discussions.
Which is sort of the classic characteristic of an abusive relationship, right?
Yeah, that's very abusive.
Don't
Like,
ask questions, just agree.
yeah, like it's not, things are not the way they used to be, and I totally agree with you. Like, I started at the same time as you. We didn't know each other until 2019, actually,
Yeah.
because we're in different departments. But I always found, up until about 2014, Mount Royal to be a great, very collegial environment.
Mhm.
As well, because it had its roots in a community college. It had a very strong sense of everyone at the institution being involved in trying to shape the institution, had very much of a teaching kind of focus. So it was very concerned about, how, the student population, and how, your teaching activities were improving education, all these kinds of things, which made for a very vibrant institution. And it's amazing to me how that could have gone so quickly. Like, that really needs some study, and that's why I'm so interested in writing about the Mount Royal case, and your own case has its own, its own dynamic, which was part of the whole story. And now, like, who knows what's happening there, in terms of, well, I know with the hiring, it's just full on, diversity, inclusion, and equity is full on in all the hiring that's going on. So that's kind of reorienting the way people think about the institution.
I wonder if there is some sort of hypothesis about that, because it's not just Mount Royal, but
No.
you're seeing this rapid decline in the collegiality,
Yeah.
Essentially from wokesters, I'll call them.
Yeah.
But a rapid decline, and I'm just hypothesizing, but it seems to be at these mid-level or mid-sized colleges, Wilfrid Laurier, Mount Royal. We're not the smallest, but we're not the largest.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a valid hypothesis, but there seems to be something there.
Yeah, well, I think with the larger institutions, they're more protected because, and you're going to find certain departments are terrible in those institutions.
Yeah.
But the whole institution is very research focused and still has a high level of expertise that's valued in the institution. So I think in the lower level, institutions, you're not as protected in terms of the research kind of focus that exists in those institutions. But I was just thinking this in terms of explaining, trying to explain the situation. There's no institution that is immune from it, because it's this whole diversity, inclusion, and equity type of perspective that is the corrosive, that causes the decline in the collegiality, because you don't have an agreement anymore. There's no common agreement as to what the standards should be at the institution. And as well, which feeds into it, is the corporatization of the university. So that's been happening at the same time. And I've studied this a little bit in terms of how the corporatization of the university and the diversity, inclusion, and equity, or the reified postmodernist kind of aspect, how there's an intersection of those two things, because the corporate managers like the arbitrariness of wokeism. So they use that, and then you really see it at Mount Royal when you get into the all the investigations and so on. There's a recording of my last disciplinary meeting with the provost, December 13th. It's on a website that's been developed about my case, woke-academy.info. Anyway, in that recording, it's 40 minutes long. Anyway, the provost shows complete contempt for any kind of due process or anything. And I was trying to have an argument. You get misled, because you think, since you're part of an academic institution, rational argument is going to be highly prized in discussions.
Not anymore.
And so you think, if I can just get a chance to argue out my case, then obviously people are going to listen to me, because this is an academic institution. But what I found time and time again is that people just didn't listen at all. Like, the decision had already been made. It didn't matter what you said. It didn't matter how articulate you were, or how the evidence that you brought to bear, the kinds of reasons that you gave for your position. That didn't matter. And this recording, it's quite disturbing, because I'm saying over and over again, how can you expect me to show remorse and accept responsibility when Mount Royal never told me what they expect? Like, they have these rules that are only known to them, and they expect everyone to somehow follow them. And then when you don't follow them, when it's not evident at all what you should be doing, they go ahead and discipline you for it. And you can argue as much as you want against them. They're just going to bring down the hammer. Anyway, hopefully, the legal system has not been so contaminated that this kind of unbelievable abusive process, hopefully that's going to be recognized.
Well, I think you hit it again. It's very abusive. What stands out for me is the in your case, how incredibly detailed the nitpicking can be in one sense.
Yeah.
And on another level, it's so ambiguous you can't possibly meet it. So there was the example that you didn't capitalize I in Indigenous. That was some sort of a harassment claim. So then you would ask, okay, so if I from now on capitalize Indigenous, is that fine? But instead of getting a clear answer on that, it seems like they switch over to some ambiguous, unattainable position that you can never meet. And as you say, the decision has long been made before you.
Well, in that case, so this is a very important part of my case. So this was the Renee Watchman complaint. And this is all documented on the woke-academy.info site. So it's important to stress that in that case, so Renee Watchman, and this is part of the problem of indigenization, is that there's been this ongoing encouragement of academics who are Indigenous to think that everything that they do should be accepted because they're Indigenous. Like, that's kind of so whatever an Indigenous person says or whatever, you should just congratulate them and so on, because they're Indigenous and they've been oppressed and so on and so forth. So this kind of enters into and you can't really blame someone like Renee Watchman for this, because Renee Watchman never received any kind of someone in authority telling her that you're in an academic institution, and Frances Widdowson is an academic, and she's allowed to question Indigenous science, and she's allowed to, make arguments in opposition to indigenization. That's all part of the academic process. There's obviously some kind of encouragement for her to see this as a huge affront to her personally. And this has been going on for many, many years. So she just had this litany of grievances about how I had done all these things to her, when I was just doing my typical academic kind of critical analysis of all these things, which I perceive to be invalid. And, people can say, well, I wasn't correct in my analysis or whatever. Like, that's all fine. Like, that's all part of the academic discussion, but that's not how Renee Watchman saw it. Renee Watchman saw that I was this kind of harassing person who was not towing the line on indigenization, which I should have kind of been forced to do, or I should have been punished by Mount Royal and so on and so forth. So when you look at Renee Watchman's complaint, it's really quite astonishing, because it has, I think, about 16 different items, and they're all like, it's just, she's complaining about my acting as an academic. Like, that's basically what she's complaining about. But the problem with that is that although almost all of those things that she complained about were found not to be harassing, the complaint itself gave the investigator leeway to basically go through my entire social media accounts and everything, and then find particular instances of, satirical activities that he thought were not, collegial or whatever, when my own view is that I had been given for 5 years by Mount Royal, I'd been given the impression that they didn't consider social media to be part of the workplace. So I wasn't really, undertaking my social media activities with some kind of view that, this was going to be part of my annual report, and I have to, have some kind of standards of professionalism that I must meet, because there was no one else at Mount Royal who was doing that at all. And people were like constantly defaming me all the time. So, so all those kinds of things, like I didn't capitalize I in Indigenous, and I referred to diversity, inclusion, and equity as DIE, and I didn't acknowledge Renee Watchman's presence for my first two years at MRU, and like all the things she said, which seemed to me to be highly frivolous, like the kinds of things she was saying, those were never found to be harassing. Like those things, they were thrown out of the complaint, but it was kind of, it gives you a bit of an insight into how Indigenous academics are viewing what should happen at a university, which is completely antithetical to any kind of critical analysis of various initiatives.
Yeah. And Frances, I think, a lot of parents, I'm going to go off topic a little bit, but a lot of parents have no idea that what their, 18, 19, 20-year-old kids are going into in universities these days, it's not like what they were dealing with 20 years ago. And most people wouldn't even believe this. It's like, how can there be a conflict over whether somebody capitalized Indigenous or not? And like, that's just the tip of the iceberg of these crazy battles that are going on in post-secondary institutions right now.
Yeah.
And I honestly think most parents just don't realize how bad it is.
Yeah, I think, well, a lot of it's underneath the surface. So like, like we would never be hearing about any of the things happening to me, except that Mount Royal decided to fire me. So now, all the gloves are off, and it's all going to be matter for review.
Which will be helpful, yeah.
But the kind of autocratic type of mindset that's kind of taken root in institutions. It wasn't that long ago, as we were saying, 2008. Everything was always, because I entered Mount Royal as a controversial figure. So Albert Howard and I had Disrobing the Aboriginal Industry was coming out a couple of months after I started. It was known that was had been co-authored by me. So my kind of interactions at Mount Royal were always had a certain amount of tension in them. Like it was kind of part of the nature of my presence at Mount Royal. But everyone understood until about 2014 that I had a place. Like I had a place just like everyone else had a place. I didn't have a privileged place, but that was how things were going to happen. And then gradually now it's understood that there's only one correct position on things. Like that's kind of what's happened, is that, and it's not explicitly stated. This is kind of the difficulty, is they say, where is it written that you must accept the trans activism position on gender, right? So, which is that, sex is not a binary, but like sex is a spectrum idea, which is highly implausible, that idea. But that is an unwritten position at Mount Royal, and probably all other universities as well. But it's not spoken. It's just, if you start to ask questions, you'll get the sense that this is very unwelcome. People will start to get angry. There will be kind of, there'll be sort of a frosty kind of climate that's going to be, and this is happening on all sorts of fronts and all sorts of issues. And students are obviously going to start to absorb this. Like this is already kind of, seeping into all aspects of the institution, which mean that students really don't feel that their kind of role that they're going to play in the institution is going to be, open inquiry and curiosity and trying to figure things out. They're going to sense that, and they're going to sense that there's kind of a position that they should adopt. And if they don't adopt it, they're going to, not do well in their courses. They're not going to, have a good degree that they get, and then they're not going to be able to get a job because they're not going to have the degree. These kinds of things are happening, and I think people should be very concerned about it. And on that level, so the whole idea of a university degree and spending time in university to sort of allow your mind to grow and to have a better understanding of things, that's gradually being kind of undermined.
Yeah.
But then those people are going to graduate, and they're going to go on to all these, what you were saying there, these kind of elite positions that are going to be the decision makers. And I've heard, I've been contacted by people in government who are saying it's terrible. If you're going to be doing policy in government, you have all sorts of things that you can't say in policy development. So the kinds of policies that are being developed are going to be very not evidence-based. It's going to be all kind of shaped by this kind of ideology, which is going to mean that all of the policies that are developed are not going to be very well thought out. And so, we're seeing it now, and it hasn't really kind of reached its maximum kind of capacity, because we're still kind of, it's still working its way through the system.
Yeah, but the cat is out of the bag. It's definitely left the university, as you say.
Yeah,
we do see it across all of society now. It's seeping in everywhere.
Yeah.
I don't know how we get over that.
Well, so their organization is the way is the way to get over it. So there's a lot of people now, well, and I guess that what's going to break first, I think, is trans activism. Trans activism is going to be the first that is going to be opposed in a big way in society.
And we're seeing that.
It's happening now.
Yeah.
You know, Woke Watch and you know, what's his name, Billboard Chris, and like a whole bunch of different people, and in the school system, opposing it in the school system.
Yeah.
This crazy thing that just happened in Ontario with this shop teacher who was wearing these big prosthetic breasts to class.
Yep.
You know, so this kind of thing, which is kind of making people think a little bit about the you know, implications. And because trans activism, like this is one of the really big problems with wokeism, is that people kind of pretend they're the ones, the woke pretend that they are the ones who are oppressed. So they're the underdog, and by you criticizing them, you are beating down on the head of the oppressed. That's kind of the tactic. With trans act, and you can sort of see that with many of these groups, and everyone has justifiable sympathy for the historic history that they've endured and so on. But with the trans activism, you have quite a large element, which is very oppressive in what it's trying to bring about. So like the men who want to get into women's prisons, and the men who want to take over women's sports, and like they are the oppressor.
Yeah.
But they're pretending by their saying that trans people are so terribly, you know, discriminated against and all this sort of thing, that they should somehow be given a pass on all these kinds of oppressive actions that they are engaged in. So I think because of the fact that they're such an oppressive character of much of the trans activism, and because of it's so obviously irrational in terms of what it's putting forward, it's going to be the weakest link in this kind of wokest kind of stuff. So I think that's where we're gonna, and it's already starting on a number of fronts, especially in the UK. The UK is really where there's a lot of organization against, you know, this group called Mermaids, and there's all this kind of gender clinics that now are being taken to task for what they're doing, and that's going to start to crumble. The trans activism, and once the trans activism starts to crumble, it's possible that the other aspects of wokeism will also start to become, you know, start to be challenged. And so that's going to be part of it, is that, you know, but the universities, even without the wokeism aspect, are in trouble because they've kind of adopted this corporate model. And that can be challenged as well, but that's going to be more of a battle. So you know, the university as a community of scholars trying to understand the way things are, that was kind of historically what it's supposed to be. It never was perfect, it never was a golden age, but there was at least some kind of sense of that. Now has been taken over by corporate managers who basically they are professionals, so they're not academics at all. Like they try to get out of, so they get their PhD in some kind of, you know, educational leadership or something like that, right? Or business or something, not a scholarly pursuit. And then they try as quickly as possible to get into being a dean, and then they become a provost and so on. And they just move from university to university, getting other positions. So they're totally separate from any academic kind of sort of ideal. Like and that's a huge problem generally for universities, which then kind of combines with this reified postmodernist stuff.
Do you mind if I run off for just a minute, Frances?
We can, it's just I can't edit the
Oh, you can't. Okay, no problem.
So let's just go for another we'll end early because I think we've covered a lot of the various things that we've been talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah. What else, Mark? What else is on your mind about
Oh, it's just such an interesting topic. I mean, and
yeah,
I think everyone's starting to talk about it now. I think you're right with the trans activism. Like that is one issue that's really hit home to a lot of people.
yeah,
I mean, I don't know how many times I see on like Facebook, somebody says, my kid in grade 3 just brought home this cartoon of
yeah,
two women having oral sex. And it's like, I'm not against that, but
yeah.
feeding
No,
it
why
to
is it in
my,
the library?
yeah. And and you're seeing right now with the school board elections.
Yeah,
I know like up locally up in Cowichan,
yeah,
I think they had 8 trustees run last time for 7 positions.
yeah,
And now they've got 18.
yeah. And so that's happened as well.
Everywhere.
So in the political level,
Yeah.
we have now a whole bunch of people running for school board, trying to fight it at the school board level. So that's going to raise it. And then a lot of it's on the trans activism stuff. Critical race theory
Yep.
is the other kind of aspect that is getting a lot of traction in the United States, especially in the United States.
Yeah, so I think you're right on that. I mean, it's
Yes.
really galvanized the public to
Yep.
say this is enough.
Anyway, Mark, I think because people have heard my story a lot and so on, and it is true that the 2 hours is quite a, intense thing for people to be listening to 2 hours. Is there anything that you wanted to have a chance to say that you weren't able to get into today?
Well, if we go back to my article,
Yeah,
it was interesting. I was trying to understand why so many people were upset with what I said. And so I went through almost all of the people that were critiquing me, and it always seemed to be this common denominator of
yeah,
someone being upset because, I don't know, they had been bullied as a minority when they were young, and they took what I was saying and they were triggered by what I was saying,
yeah.
and that sort of hurt was reignited.
Mm,
And so I found that quite interesting,
yeah.
in the sense that maybe it triggered you, but you completely missed the point of what I was saying.
Yeah,
And
and as well, even if you trigger people,
yeah,
why should, for an academic to have a piece that just is raising some concerns, and maybe you're completely misguided in your analysis and so on,
maybe I am, yeah, but
why should that have career ending kind of circumstances? I'm amazed how the diversity kind of position that thou must see it as a good that cannot be questioned,
mhm.
and that's the end of it, and we don't want to hear any more about that. That's kind of the attitude about it, which I find very surprising because obviously that mantra that you were saying, diversity is our strength, it sort of depends upon what kind of diversity you're talking about in
Right.
order for diversity to be our strength. And having a diverse, having one person want to have the caste system brought back in and another person not, and having huge kind of arguments, that's obviously not a strengthening thing for society. One person who thinks that sexism is a completely valid position, another person who's anti-sexist, that's not going to be a strengthening kind of thing. So I think that the whole critical analysis aspect, which should be part of the discussion about diversity, inclusion, and equity, has now been completely thrown out the window, and it's kind of seen as a dogmatic kind of almost, like a position that one must just accept without question. And that kind of thing, having that sort of approach in any kind of throughout society, in a supposed free society, that's kind of doesn't bode well for what's going to happen in the future.
Yeah, it's very authoritarian. It's quite chilling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And on
Well,
that note,
Mark,
it was a
I
pleasure,
think we've
Francis.
covered a lot of ground here, so
We did.
and we've gone for like an hour and 45 minutes, so it's pretty close to 2 hours. So I wanted to thank you very much for appearing on the Rational Space Disputations.
Oh, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.